We did not return to the moon because of budgets, politics, or a simple loss of interest. The actual reason is something else entirely. And this is not coming from some random person on the internet with a theory. These words belong to Charles Duke, a man who physically walked on the lunar surface, an astronaut from Apollo 16, a brigadier general in the United States Air Force, and the very voice that guided Neil Armstrong through the Apollo 11 landing. Just think about that for a moment. If a man of that stature kept quiet for 40 years, what exactly did he witness? What truly took place in the Descartes Highlands? That Houston did not just go silent for a couple of seconds, but deliberately went completely quiet. And the biggest question hanging over all of this is, if any of that is true, then why have we still not returned to that place? This is where everything starts, with a mission NASA publicly described as perfect. But the reality might have looked very different from what was written in any official report. What Duke encountered out there was not simply a discovery, it was a secret with the potential to shake everything humanity thought it understood. So stay with this until the very end. Before we get into the deeper details, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss anything like this. Now, here is the most important thing to understand right from the start. Charles Duke was not the kind of man who frightened easily or invented stories out of thin air. This is the same individual who joined NASA back in 1966 and almost immediately built a reputation as one of the sharpest and most dependable pilots the entire program had ever seen. Before that, he had already flown some of the most technically advanced fighter jets the Air Force operated, which means his entire life was built on precision rather than imagination. Facts were what he lived inside, and he approached everything by carefully measuring and analyzing it first. Simply believing something without solid evidence was never part of who he was. And if you remember Apollo 11 at all, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were descending toward the lunar surface, the last steady voice they heard before touching down was Duke's. That now famous line about people back on Earth holding their breath could never have come from a nervous person. It could only come from someone who stays completely calm no matter how intense the pressure gets. So it is obvious that Duke was the kind of man who did not unravel even while the entire world was listening and when 2 human lives rested on his steadiness. Now consider this carefully. If a man that composed and battle-tested holds his silence for 40 years and then finally decides to speak, would he do so without a genuine reason? Let us take the story back a little. The 16th of April, 1972. That was the day Charles Duke and his commander John Young lifted off toward the moon aboard Apollo 16. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. No drama, no complications, just another mission focused on expanding what we knew about the moon. Once they landed, they spent roughly 71 hours on the surface, which was longer than the majority of earlier missions. Their chosen landing site was the Descartes Highlands, an ancient and rugged region of the lunar terrain. Scientists at the time believed this area had volcanic origins, which meant it could potentially reveal a great deal about the moon's earliest history. Their work got underway, thoroughly scientific, completely by the book. They drove the lunar rover across miles of that barren, powdery landscape, exploring territory no human eyes had ever taken in before. Craters, ridges, rocks, and slopes. Samples were gathered from all over. Every single experiment on the checklist got done. Every step was calculated in advance. Every movement had been pre-planned. From the outside looking in, everything appeared absolutely textbook. Communication with mission control stayed smooth throughout. The astronauts carried out their tasks without a single hiccup. Every data reading was coming in as expected. That is precisely why NASA ranked Apollo 16 among its greatest successes. Every goal reached, every task finished. But the real story begins the moment you stop watching those carefully edited highlights and start going through the full, uncut footage instead. The same footage most people never sit through because everything on the surface appears completely ordinary. Now picture that silent, empty lunar landscape, dust coating everything, craters surrounding the area, a gray expanse stretching out endlessly in every direction. The camera is running. Charles Duke is going about his work, gathering samples, moving toward the rover. Everything looks perfectly routine. But then, without any warning, something odd happens. Duke simply stops mid-stride, as though someone hit a pause button on him. His foot freezes halfway through a step. His hands stay locked right where they are. His entire body language shifts in an instant. He is no longer working. He is just staring at something. But at what exactly? That is the strange part. The camera captures nothing unusual. The frame still shows the same empty ground, yet Duke's gaze is locked onto something beyond it, somewhere outside the frame, something the camera cannot reach. For several seconds he stands completely still, as though even he cannot make sense of what he is looking at. Then the radio breaks the silence with John Young's voice. "Charlie, are you all right?" Pay close attention to that moment. This is not an idle, casual question being asked. It is coming from someone who has known Duke for years, someone with the instinct to sense immediately when something is not right. Then there's a long pause, longer than a normal communication delay, heavier. And when Duke's voice finally returns, it isn't as steady as it was before. A little slow, a little distant. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just looking." 3 tiny words, but the weight behind them is enormous. Because the real question is, what exactly was he looking at? Moments like this occur more than once throughout the footage. Small, quiet moments where Duke suddenly stops, freezes for several seconds, then gathers himself and returns to work as if nothing happened. Now, from this point forward, the story begins to get genuinely strange. Because what Charles Duke and John Young experienced out there doesn't fit inside any training manual, any scientific framework, or any rational logic. Let's start with the light. Basic physics tells us that sunlight hitting the lunar surface should appear entirely white. There's no atmosphere, which means no scattering, no blue sky, no color at all, just direct, hard, white light. But Duke described something quite different on multiple occasions. Faint flashes of blue and violet light, as though something somewhere was producing its own glow. Initially, he assumed it was a reflection off his visor or some kind of instrument glare. But when he paid closer attention, he understood it was something else entirely, because that light was shifting on its own, sometimes dim, sometimes brighter, sometimes appearing in one spot, then suddenly somewhere else entirely. He'd look away and look back, and the picture had already changed, in a place where absolutely nothing is supposed to change, and it didn't stop there. The most unsettling thing of all was the sounds. Think about that for a moment. In a vacuum, sound simply cannot exist. The moon has no air, no medium through which vibrations can travel, and yet Duke said he could hear things, different tones, different frequencies, sometimes smooth, almost melodic, like some distant tune drifting in from nowhere, and sometimes so strange and wrong that it genuinely disturbed him. At first, he assumed it was radio interference or some kind of mechanical vibration inside the suit, but then he glanced over at Young and asked, "Do you hear that too?" And Young replied, "Yes." That's when things became truly heavy, because now this wasn't one person's private experience. 2 highly trained astronauts, both perceiving the exact same thing. Something that physics says flatly should not be possible. Then there was time. Time itself didn't seem to function the way it normally should. Duke would be working, feel as though maybe 2 or 3 minutes had gone by, then check his suit clock, and 20 minutes had vanished, and sometimes the reverse happened. The clock read 5 minutes, but it felt as though a full hour had passed. This didn't happen once or twice. It repeated itself all throughout the mission. Young noticed the same thing. Their internal sense of time and the mission clock were never in agreement with each other. There was also a feeling, one that's incredibly difficult to put into words. Duke described how, during his entire time on the lunar surface, he felt constantly like something was watching them. Not Houston, not Young, but something else, something invisible, yet unmistakably present. And this wasn't a fleeting sensation. It remained with them the whole time, from the very moment they stepped out onto the moon, right up until they climbed back into the module. Picture 2 astronauts standing in endless silence on a lifeless world and feeling with complete certainty that they are not alone. And here's what makes it even more fascinating. All of these experiences, the lights, the sounds, the warped sense of time, that persistent feeling of a presence, were entirely subjective. Cameras couldn't record them. They couldn't be bottled up as samples and brought home for analysis. Now here's something worth understanding very carefully. Everything described so far, the strange lights, the impossible sounds, the distorted time, was deeply unsettling, yes. But the honest truth is that Charles Duke did not stay quiet for 40 years simply because of those experiences. They were part of his memory, certainly, but the real reason for his silence was something altogether different. Something that wasn't merely felt, but actually seen. Something physical, something solid, something that was simply not easy to dismiss or explain away. That moment arrived when Duke and John Young were roughly 6 kilometers from their lunar module on the far side of a hill, so distant that even Earth had disappeared from the sky above them. Try to picture that location, how hollow, how profoundly alien it must have felt. Gray ground stretching out in every direction with nothing else. No sound, no movement, just a frozen and absolute stillness. Ahead of them sat their rover and one straightforward task, collecting geological samples. Nothing remarkable, no grand experiment, just the same standard procedure they had run through hundreds of times before. The kind of work so deeply familiar that your hands do it while your mind barely registers it. Duke was doing precisely that, crouching down, examining soil and rocks, picking up specimens, recording notes, everything completely routine, identical to every other moment of the mission. But then, quite casually, he lifted his head to glance toward the horizon, and in that single instant, something shifted. At first, he couldn't even identify what felt off. Everything appeared as the moon always does, irregular, broken, scattered. But something wasn't sitting right. There was something unusual about the shapes out there, something that simply did not belong. Duke held completely still for a few seconds, as though his brain was struggling to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. Then, slowly, he called out to Young, and from that moment something began that would shift the entire direction of this story. Charles Duke gazed out toward the horizon, and what he found there wasn't merely unusual, it was wrong, fundamentally wrong. On the moon, everything is disorder. Craters thrown across every surface, rocks shattered apart, the ground pockmarked with impact after impact. Meteorites have been slamming into it for billions of years. There is no symmetry, no clean geometry. Everything is random. Yet standing on that horizon was something that shattered all of that logic entirely. Duke called over to John Young. Without a single word, Young brought the rover to a stop, and for a few seconds the two of them simply stared out at it. Then, gradually, they began moving in that direction. The rover's wheels churned up the surface dust, that fine lunar powder drifting upward, hanging for a brief moment in the void before settling back down like soft ash falling to earth. The same silence surrounded them, the same vast emptiness. But now that silence carried something different inside it, a peculiar tension that hadn't been there before. As they drew nearer, the shape sharpened into focus. What had first appeared to be some odd pattern was becoming something else entirely. Straight lines, perfectly, unmistakably straight. Edges so crisp they could not have come from nature. Angles so exact they couldn't possibly be coincidental. And then, all at once, it was obvious. A wall, or perhaps the foundation of something far greater. A block-like formation with defined corners, as though stones had been deliberately placed and arranged. Seen from above, it would have been blanketed by a thick coat of regolith, as though time itself had slowly pulled it underground. But beneath all of that, the shape remained unmistakably artificial. Duke put its length at roughly 100 meters, and the strangest element was that both ends vanished beneath the surface, as though the moon had half consumed it. It didn't seem finished or whole. It felt like a single fragment of something vastly larger, like the spine of an enormous buried structure reaching deep below. That same blue and violet glow Duke had noticed earlier was now considerably more intense, almost gathering itself around the structure, washing softly across its surface as though the structure itself was somehow interacting with the light. and those sounds that had seemed so distant before were now far more distinct. The same low hum, the same strange tones, but now they had a clear origin, as though they were being projected directly from that structure. At times, they felt almost like music, and at other times so deeply unsettling that something tightened inside your chest just from hearing them. Duke and Young stood motionless for a moment, silent and still, as though their minds were simply unable to process what lay before them. No explanation arrived, so Duke did exactly what his training demanded. In a measured, steady voice, he transmitted a report over the radio. He described a geometric structure directly ahead of them, something bearing none of the characteristics of natural formation. Straight edges, uniform angles, estimated length of around 100 meters. He stated plainly that this object had no business being there. Then he requested guidance. What were they supposed to do? His voice carried no trace of panic, only the crisp clarity of a trained astronaut doing his job. But what followed that transmission became the heaviest part of this entire account. On the other end of the radio, there was nothing. Complete silence. And this wasn't the standard communication delay Duke was accustomed to. He knew precisely how long NASA's responses normally took. This time, that rhythm was broken. Several seconds passed, then several more, and the quiet kept stretching outward. Duke and Young exchanged a glance without speaking a word, both feeling that something was seriously off. Inside that silence, Duke could make out the sound of his own breathing inside the helmet, the gentle hiss of the oxygen system, the faint murmur of open-channel background noise, but nothing from Houston. He tried again. "Houston, do you copy?" Still nothing. Just sit with that for a second. Two human beings standing on the surface of the moon directly in front of something that has no right to exist there, and the only people who can hear them are choosing not to respond. That's what makes it genuinely disturbing. Because as extraordinary as the structure itself was, Houston's behavior was even stranger, as though they already knew what was out there, as though this was not a new discovery at all, but something already documented and understood. Then the silence finally cracked, but the response that came through made everything feel colder. The voice was flat and completely drained of emotion. "Apollo 16, continue with your scheduled EVA and sample collection." That was all. No questions, no curiosity, no effort whatsoever to engage with what had just been reported. As if nothing they had said held any relevance. That was the moment Duke first understood that something here was being deliberately set aside. But Duke and Young weren't willing to simply walk away from it. They carried on with their assigned tasks, but while doing so, they photographed that structure as thoroughly as they could manage. Close-up shots, wide angles, multiple perspectives, reference frames, everything the camera could capture. Duke later stated clearly that those images were sharp and precise. He had held the camera himself, pressed the shutter himself, and he was entirely certain about what had been recorded on that film. But the biggest question stands right here. If those photographs were actually taken, why has nobody ever seen them? When Duke reached out to NASA about those images years later, he got a different answer every single time. On some occasions, he was told the photos were classified. Other times, he heard they had been lost during archive transfers, and sometimes that their quality had deteriorated so badly they couldn't be released. But Duke never bought any of those explanations, and he kept coming back to the same point. He was there in person. He witnessed it with his own eyes. He took those photographs himself, and he remains convinced that those images still exist somewhere out there, perhaps in a place the general public can never access. And right here, this story stops being a straightforward mystery. It turns into something else entirely, something that feels less like unanswered questions and more like deliberately hidden answers. In a 2019 interview, when Charles Duke was asked point blank, "Did those structures appear new or ancient?" he went quiet for a moment, then gave a slow nod and said, "Old, very old." Now that reply sounds simple enough, but its meaning is deeply troubling because nothing of that sort should exist on the moon. There is no atmosphere, no rainfall, no weather at all, which means there is no erosion. Anything constructed, there ought to remain virtually unchanged. Yet Duke said those structures showed unmistakable signs of wear, as though they had been sitting there for an extraordinarily long time. Their surfaces carried small pits, tiny impact craters, which don't develop over a year or two, but rather across millions, perhaps even billions of years, of continuous micrometeorite strikes. That clearly indicates it was not something recently constructed, and it couldn't have been built by humans either because our species didn't even walk the Earth yet at the time when those marks must have begun forming. This is the moment when Charles Duke's voice shifts. He pauses briefly, as though searching carefully for the right words, and then in a very quiet voice he says, "Those structures are older than human existence itself." Just sit with that for a second. It means whoever constructed that structure was around before our species ever appeared. Someone else, some form of intelligence that preceded us entirely. When Duke was pressed on who that could possibly be, his response became even more disturbing. He said, "I don't know, but someone or something built on the moon." At a time when our kind didn't even exist yet, and NASA is aware of it. Up until this point, the story might seem like it rests on the shoulders of just one man, but its true weight arrives when it expands beyond a single individual and becomes about many. In 2017, a private gathering took place. The surviving moonwalkers from the Apollo program came together in one room. Just picture that scene. People at that stage of their lives, white hair, unhurried steps, and yet the very same individuals who once walked on the moon, who took part in the most perilous and demanding missions in the history of human exploration. According to Duke, this was the first occasion they had spoken candidly among themselves, free from pressure and free from fear. And what surfaced was simple, but carried enormous weight. Every single one of them had encountered something strange, different missions, different eras, but one thread ran through all their experiences. Something that simply didn't align with the official account. NASA had presented the world with a tidy, straightforward narrative, but in their own memories, that story was far from simple. Now, if only one person had said this, people might have dismissed it entirely. But this situation was different. Astronauts from separate missions spanning different decades were all pointing in roughly the same direction. Take Buzz Aldrin as an example, the very man who touched down on the moon alongside Neil Armstrong, who openly challenged conspiracy theorists. That same Buzz later spoke in earnest about a monolith-like object on Phobos. He wasn't being flippant. His tone made it unmistakably clear this was no light matter for him. He said openly that it deserved proper investigation. And then there is Edgar Mitchell. People say that after returning from the moon, he was simply not the same person. His entire way of thinking had shifted. In his later years, he stated openly that alien intelligence is real, that governments are aware of it, and that evidence has existed for decades. Interviewers frequently tried to minimize his words, but Mitchell kept repeating the same things calmly and with absolute conviction. And then comes Al Worden, who said in one interview that he genuinely believes humans may be descended from beings who arrived from somewhere beyond. Now, this was no ordinary individual speaking. This was someone who had orbited the moon, someone who had looked out into space with his own eyes. One thing becomes very clear at this point. These were not people huddled in a basement inventing stories. These were decorated military officers, elite test pilots, scientists with doctoral degrees, individuals chosen from thousands of candidates for the most hazardous missions imaginable. They had everything to lose: their careers, their reputations, their legacies. When Charles Duke was asked, "Is something genuinely being concealed?" he didn't respond like someone chasing conspiracy theories. He didn't claim people were gathered in secret rooms scheming away. His answer was far more direct, and perhaps that is exactly what makes it more unsettling. He said, "This is not a conspiracy." And this is a kind of deep institutional inertia. A reality where even when the truth exists, accepting it or bringing it forward to the world becomes nearly impossible. According to Duke, NASA holds an enormous volume of material from the Apollo program. Photographs, direct observations, mission reports, all pointing toward the idea that the moon is far more than the lifeless rock we've always been told about. And beyond that, there is something else, something capable of reshaping the entire narrative we've been given. But if any of this were released publicly, its consequences wouldn't stop at the boundaries of science. It could shake the very foundation of human thought. The single greatest question that would surface is this: are we truly alone in this universe? And if the answer is no, then where exactly do we fit into it? This is the moment where Duke says something that stands as the most significant revelation in this entire story. He says, "We could have continued this work." His meaning was unmistakable. The Apollo program didn't need to stop where it did. We could have established bases on the moon, launched further missions, and genuinely understood what was really out there. The technology existed, the capability was there, and perhaps most crucially, the people directly involved had the determination. Astronauts and engineers were eager to press forward with that exploration. I reported what I witnessed at the time, but nobody listened. I took photographs, and those photographs vanished. I am speaking now because the public deserves to know the truth. There is no theatrics in his voice, no trembling fear, just a calm, direct honesty, like a man finally setting down a weight he has quietly carried inside for decades. And the most haunting part is that everything he described is still out there, even today. In the Descartes Highlands, those formations remain standing, just as they have for millions of years. The photographs that Duke and John Young captured may well be sitting in some archive somewhere, sealed away, locked behind closed doors, unseen by anyone. And at that reunion in 2017, where astronauts spoke more openly than they ever had before, the questions they carefully discussed in hushed tones still remain without answers. And this is where the story doesn't simply end. It grows heavier and more tangled, because what we're left with are two questions that are genuinely difficult to walk away from. The first, if Duke is mistaken, if everything he described is simply a misunderstanding, then why are astronauts from entirely separate missions, separate eras, and separate decades all describing strikingly similar things? And the second, if Duke is right, if structures genuinely exist on the moon that predate humanity itself, then why have 50 years passed without any serious investigation? Why haven't we returned to look more closely? Why has all of this been kept from the world? And the question now sitting directly in front of you is this: if NASA holds those photographs, that mission data, those first-hand crew observations, why haven't they been made available to the public even now? What is it exactly that they are still shielding us from? And what is it they fear? That once we finally know the truth, we won't be able to go back to the way things were.